It is a scene that has gripped the heart of France and stunned the international community. A raging inferno, the largest wildfire the country has faced in decades, continues to consume vast stretches of land, leaving destruction, ash, and uncertainty in its wake. Entire communities have been forced to flee with little more than the clothes on their backs, roads are choked with evacuating vehicles, and the skies above once picturesque towns are now a deep, choking orange, in an era already defined by climate emergencies and political polarization. This wildfire has become more than a natural disaster. It is now a test of leadership, governance, and national unity, with every decision made under the searing pressure of public scrutiny. What makes this tragedy even more politically charged is the timing. It unfolds as France faces both internal political fractures and international criticism over its climate policy commitments. At its core, this disaster is not only a human story of loss and resilience, but also a political and institutional stress test. The nation's firefighting resources, disaster preparedness frameworks, and intergovernmental cooperation mechanisms are being pushed to their breaking point. Local authorities warn that the flames, fueled by record-breaking heatwaves and relentless winds, are defying containment efforts despite the deployment of hundreds of firefighters, dozens of aircraft, and emergency personnel from across the European Union. Meanwhile, opposition voices are seizing the moment to question whether the French government has learned from past environmental crises or if systemic neglect has allowed the perfect conditions for this catastrophe to ignite. The displacement of thousands has now triggered a secondary wave of challenges. Emergency shelters are overcrowded. Public health concerns are rising due to heat stress and smoke inhalation, and agricultural losses threaten to ripple into the already fragile European food supply chain. Each hour the fire burns adds not only to the environmental toll but also to the economic and political costs. This is where public perception becomes crucial. While President Emmanuel Macron's administration has pledged unwavering commitment to combating the fire and supporting victims, critics say the government's climate adaptation strategies remain more rhetoric than reality. And in a political environment where far-right and far-left factions are eager to frame every crisis as evidence of establishment failure, this wildfire is quickly becoming a narrative battlefield. Yet, beyond France's borders, the wildfire has also reignited a broader conversation about climate responsibility and leadership in an era of increasingly frequent mega-disasters. In European diplomatic circles, there is mounting concern that France, historically positioned as a champion of the Paris Climate Accord, may now be seen as struggling to meet its own environmental resilience goals. Images of the blaze have made global headlines, and the international press is drawing comparisons to wildfires in California, Australia, and Greece, where the intersection of climate change, politics, and public safety has been similarly explosive. The pressure is on for Macron's administration to demonstrate not just tactical firefighting efficiency but also long-term policy competence, a balancing act that could define the political trajectory of the remainder of his term. For the displaced residents, however, politics feels secondary to survival. The human stories emerging from the fire zone are harrowing. Families separated in the chaos of evacuation, livelihoods reduced to cinders, and the haunting uncertainty of not knowing whether there will be anything to return to. But as history has shown, in moments of national crisis, the ability of leadership to channel empathy into effective action can determine not just public trust but also the shape of the political landscape for years to come. And this is why the stakes are far higher than extinguishing a wildfire. This is about whether France can demonstrate resilience in the face of one of the most dangerous combinations of environmental fury and political fragility it has faced in decades. The current wildfire tearing through France began under conditions that experts had long warned could converge into a perfect storm, a prolonged drought that left vast swaths of vegetation bone dry, combined with record-breaking summer temperatures and gusty winds sweeping in from the Mediterranean. Initial reports suggest that the blaze ignited in the late afternoon along the edges of a pine forest near the southwestern coast, an area already on high alert due to smaller seasonal fires. Earlier in the summer, within hours, embers carried by shifting winds ignited multiple spot fires, quickly overwhelming local containment lines. Firefighters, accustomed to battling smaller-scale seasonal burns, suddenly found themselves facing a wall of flames moving faster than evacuation alerts could be issued. By nightfall on the first day, The fire had consumed thousands of hectares of woodland, and emergency services began a full-scale evacuation of surrounding villages. Entire neighborhoods were emptied in a matter of hours, with police and civil defense units going door-to-door urging residents to leave. The government activated its highest emergency response level, mobilizing reinforcements from across the country and calling in aerial firefighting assets from neighboring EU member states. Despite these measures, containment proved elusive. Meteorological forecasts predicted at least 5 more days of hot, dry, and windy conditions, a worst-case scenario for frontline crews. As one firefighter put it grimly, "We are not fighting the fire, we are chasing it." This wildfire, described by some as the largest in living memory for the region, has already surpassed the scale of the devastating blazes France experienced in 2003 and 2019. In both of those years, national inquiries found that inadequate investment in forest management, combined with delayed modernization of firefighting equipment, had left certain rural areas dangerously exposed. Yet those same recommendations increased buffer zones between wildlands and residential areas, expansion of rapid deployment firefighting units, and more aggressive tree-clearing programs remain partially implemented. That historical parallel has become a political flashpoint in the current crisis, with opposition lawmakers accusing the Macron administration of failing to address vulnerabilities that experts have highlighted for nearly 2 decades. The scale of destruction this year also invites comparison to the infamous European heatwave of 2003, which killed over 15,000 people in France alone. That event transformed public consciousness about climate vulnerability, yet critics argue that it did not translate into the kind of climate resilience policies capable of preventing today's disaster. The current wildfire, while fueled by immediate weather conditions, is symptomatic of a broader pattern: hotter summers, longer dry seasons, and more frequent extreme weather events tied to climate change. This is where environmental science intersects directly with politics. France has prided itself on its role in forging the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, but environmental groups are now questioning whether the government's domestic policy keeps pace with its international commitments. Beyond environmental factors, the wildfire has also exposed underlying political divisions within France. The far right has seized on the disaster to accuse the government of neglecting rural communities in favor of urban and metropolitan priorities. Some left-wing critics, meanwhile, are framing the blaze as proof that neoliberal economic policies have weakened the country's capacity to respond to large-scale crises by underfunding public services. This convergence of critiques from opposite ends of the spectrum puts Macron's centrist coalition in a politically precarious position. Managing the optics of the disaster has become almost as challenging as managing the fire itself. Adding to the tension is the broader European political landscape. The European Union's joint disaster response mechanisms have been engaged to support firefighting efforts, but this has sparked debates within France about sovereignty, self-reliance, and the government's ability to protect its own citizens without outside help. Such debates echo past controversies, like the reliance on EU support during the COVID-19 vaccine rollout and flood recovery efforts in Germany and Belgium. In each of these cases, public opinion was sharply divided between those who saw EU solidarity as a strength and those who viewed it as a sign of national weakness. Economically, the impact of the wildfire is already being felt. Vineyards in the affected region, some of which produce globally renowned wines, have reported total losses for the season. Tourism, a major revenue stream for coastal and countryside communities, has collapsed overnight as holidaymakers cancel trips. Insurance claims are expected to run into the billions, placing further strain on an economy already grappling with inflationary pressures and the energy crisis. This, in turn, will likely influence the political conversation in the months ahead, as parties jockey to position themselves as the most capable stewards of economic recovery. The wildfire crisis is therefore not an isolated environmental incident, but a multi-layered challenge at the intersection of climate science, governance, political competition, and economic resilience. France has been here before, after catastrophic floods in 1988, after the deadly forest fires of 2003, after the fuel shortages during the Yellow Vest protests in 2018, each time forced to reassess how prepared it truly is for systemic shocks. The question now is whether this latest disaster will become another case study in missed opportunities or a turning point that forces both political and public consensus on the urgency of climate adaptation. The wildfire has not only dominated headlines across France but has also become a focal point for international media coverage, each outlet framing the disaster through its own editorial lens. Domestically, major French broadcasters like France 24 and TF1 have devoted wall-to-wall coverage to the unfolding crisis, often leading with aerial footage of charred forests and destroyed villages. This visual imagery has been coupled with emotional interviews from displaced residents, many of whom have lost homes, businesses, and decades of personal history to the flames. In this framing, the wildfire is presented not just as an environmental catastrophe but as a deeply human tragedy, one that demands immediate political accountability. Internationally, the BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera have largely contextualized the French wildfire within a global pattern of climate-driven disasters, drawing parallels to the 2023 wildfires in Greece, Canada, and Hawaii. In these reports, the French crisis is less an isolated incident and more a symptom of a larger, escalating planetary emergency. The tone is often urgent, warning that even developed nations with sophisticated firefighting infrastructure are not immune to the accelerating consequences of climate change. This narrative places added pressure on French authorities to demonstrate leadership not just in managing the current fire, but in spearheading more ambitious climate adaptation policies. At home and abroad, the political fallout has been swift and, in some quarters, brutal. Opposition parties have seized the moment to criticize President Emmanuel Macron's government, accusing it of failing to heed years of scientific warnings about wildfire risks. Left-wing parties, particularly the Greens and La France Insoumise, have framed the wildfire as the inevitable result of chronic underinvestment in environmental protection and emergency services. Their argument hinges on the assertion that firefighting budgets have been stretched thin by years of austerity-driven policy choices, leaving rural regions particularly exposed. On the right, parties like Les Républicains have taken a different tack, focusing less on climate change and more on what they call strategic incompetence in crisis management. They point to delays in evacuation orders, logistical bottlenecks in deploying reinforcements, and the government's reliance on EU assistance as evidence of systemic weakness. Far-right voices, notably from Marine Le Pen's National Rally, have weaponized the crisis in a different way, portraying it as part of a broader narrative of state failure to protect the real French rural and semi-rural communities that they claim are consistently overlooked in favor of Paris and other urban centers. Stakeholders beyond the political sphere have also weighed in forcefully. Environmental NGOs, such as Greenpeace France and Friends of the Earth, have called for an independent inquiry into the government's wildfire preparedness strategy. They argue that while climate change is indeed a key driver of such disasters, poor land use planning, inadequate forest management, and insufficient community-based prevention programs have all contributed to the scale of destruction. Meanwhile, France's powerful agricultural unions are warning of severe economic consequences, with some vineyards in the Bordeaux region reporting total losses for the year's harvest. Their demands for government compensation packages are likely to become a contentious budgetary issue in the coming months. From a policy perspective, the wildfire could be a watershed moment for France's approach to climate resilience and disaster preparedness. If history is any guide, crises of this magnitude tend to produce short bursts of legislative activity, as was the case after the 2003 heatwave, which prompted reforms in elderly care and heatwave response protocols. The challenge will be sustaining political will beyond the immediate news cycle. Already, some members of Macron's centrist coalition are floating proposals for a national wildfire prevention act, which would mandate expanded fire breaks, increase funding for aerial firefighting fleets, and stricter building codes in high-risk zones. However, there are political landmines ahead. Any significant increase in funding for wildfire prevention would require trade-offs in the national budget, potentially forcing cuts to other programs or tax increases, both politically risky moves. Additionally, measures such as compulsory land clearing around private properties or restrictions on certain agricultural practices are likely to encounter resistance from powerful interest groups. In other words, the path from public outrage to actual policy change is far from guaranteed, The European dimension cannot be ignored either. France's reliance on EU disaster assistance, particularly aircraft and personnel from Italy, Spain, and Greece, will fuel ongoing debates about sovereignty and self-reliance in crisis management. Pro-European voices argued that such cooperation is precisely the kind of solidarity the EU was designed to deliver, while Eurosceptics see it as yet another example of France outsourcing its own responsibilities. This tug-of-war could influence not only environmental policy debates but also the broader political positioning of parties ahead of the next presidential election. In the end, the political implications of this wildfire are likely to extend well beyond environmental policy. It has become a proxy battle over the competence, priorities, and values of the French state itself, whether the government sees rural communities as integral to the nation's future, whether it is willing to confront the economic and social trade-offs of serious climate adaptation, and whether it can navigate the increasingly polarized narratives shaping public opinion. For President Macron and his administration, the stakes could hardly be higher. This is not just about containing a fire, but about containing the political blaze it has ignited. Public sentiment in France has been deeply shaken by the wildfire, not just because of the scale of destruction, but because it feels like the culmination of years of warnings that went unheeded. Across social media, hashtags like #FEUDefrance, #climatecrisis, and #SOLIDARIDACUTE have trended for days, with citizens posting images of scorched landscapes alongside pointed criticisms of government priorities. For many, the wildfire has become a symbol of vulnerability, the unsettling realization that in a matter of hours, entire communities can be reduced to ash despite living in one of the world's most developed nations. This realization is cutting across traditional political divides, uniting people in grief but also in anger. Yet, that unity is fragile, as competing narratives begin to polarize the national conversation. Historically, France has faced national traumas that force shifts in governance and policy priorities. The 2003 heatwave, which killed nearly 15,000 people, transformed how the nation prepared for extreme temperatures. The Yellow Vest protests, sparked in 2018 by a fuel tax but ultimately fueled by a deeper sense of rural neglect, forced President Macron to rethink the balance between climate policy and economic justice. Even further back, natural disasters like the 1999 Lothar and Martin storms, which tore through much of Western Europe, spurred structural reforms in disaster management. The wildfire of 2025 now stands as the latest entry in this list of transformative events, with the potential to reshape environmental policy and test France's political cohesion. However, the parallels with past crises also serve as a cautionary tale. After the 2003 heatwave, there was a flurry of reforms, but much of the urgency faded as the years passed and political attention shifted elsewhere. The question now is whether this wildfire will trigger sustained commitment or simply produce another cycle of political promises followed by gradual neglect. Public opinion surveys conducted in the days following the disaster already show a surge in demands for immediate action, not just in firefighting capacity, but in long-term climate resilience. Nearly 70% of respondents in one national poll said they believe the government has been too slow to adapt to the realities of climate change, and more than half supported reallocating military resources toward civil protection during peacetime. For the government, this presents a double-edged sword. On one hand, the wildfire has created a political opening for bold climate and disaster management reforms. On the other, the public mood is unforgiving, and any missteps, whether in compensation for victims, in rebuilding efforts, or in preventing future disasters, could become political liabilities. The opposition will be watching closely, ready to frame even minor administrative failures as evidence of systemic incompetence. In this environment, Macron's administration must strike a delicate balance, move fast enough to demonstrate urgency, but not so hastily that proposed policies crumble under scrutiny or special interest resistance. The broader lesson for France, and indeed for other nations watching, is that environmental disasters are no longer distant possibilities but present-day political flashpoints. They test not only the readiness of emergency services, but also the adaptability of political systems, the resilience of communities, and the willingness of leaders to take difficult, sometimes unpopular decisions in the name of long-term safety. This wildfire, like the pandemics, floods, and economic shocks of the past decade, will likely be remembered as a defining moment of political and societal reckoning. And so, the call to action is clear. For citizens, it is to remain engaged beyond the initial surge of outrage, to hold leaders accountable not just for words but for measurable results. For policymakers, it is to recognize that climate adaptation is no longer a niche environmental issue, but a core matter of national security and public trust. For the international community, it is to see France's struggle as a warning and an opportunity, a warning of the costs of delay, and an opportunity to share resources, technology, and strategies before the next disaster strikes, because if history teaches us anything, it is that crises ignored become crises repeated, and this time, with temperatures rising, seasons shifting, and nature's volatility increasing, the stakes are higher than ever. The question is not whether France can rebuild from this fire. It will. The question is whether the nation will have the courage to build differently, to confront the political, economic, and cultural patterns that made such devastation possible. That decision, much like the wildfire itself, is spreading fast, and the time to act is now.